From points far and wide around the metro, it's time for Thunder Thursday. I'm Jenny Carlson here at my home in Oklahoma City, joined by some other snowbound compatriots of mine, that being Thunder beat writer Eric Horn. Eric, how you doing?
I'm great.
And fellow columnist Barry Trammell from his home in Norman. How you doing, Barry?
Great.
Good deal. All right, guys, even though we are iced in, snowed in, whatever in the heck's happening outside your house is keeping you there just like us. So we still wanted to talk some Thunder today, obviously getting going tonight, Thursday night, second half, as they say, of the season, although obviously only a couple months left of this thing for the Thunder, really trying to hit the accelerator towards the playoffs. And Eric, you wrote earlier this week about what the Thunder really needs to do as it approaches these final couple months of the season. At the top of your list, it was about Carmelo Anthony, that third superstar on this team. And we saw him obviously hit that huge shot down the stretch at Memphis, sort of what you'd expect from him, what they want to expect from him, but they may need more. What does the Thunder need to do to really get him going, and how important is that to them?
Well, it's critically important because he's another individual shot creator they brought in, a guy that can be useful in the playoffs. As poorly as he shot the ball at times this year, he's still going to be a guy that they're going to rely on in a playoff series to be able to create shots on his own. That's one more guy that they had that could create shots on his own that they didn't have last year. The question is, is he going to be able to do it when called upon? Is he going to be able to do it maybe in less minutes? Right now, Carmelo Anthony's around that 30-minute mark. Ideally, you might want to have him play less minutes so you can get other guys on the floor like a Patrick Patterson or Jeremy Grant, who can either get to the foul line at a higher rate that Jeremy Grant is doing, or stretch the floor better from the three-point range. Patrick Patterson's doing a really good job of as of late. So the question for Carmelo Anthony is, how is this guy going to be able to perform, and are you going to be able to keep him out there for stretches at a time or longer stretches when the playoffs start, the rotation shorten? If he's missing shots, if he's shooting 41%, a career low like he is when the playoffs start, that's going to be a problem for your team, for a guy that they like to get possessions in isolation. They like to get him those transition three-pointers. And we all know that Carmelo is not a great defensive player. As much as Billy Donovan likes to talk about Carmelo's communication being key on defense, he does try to communicate, but he's also a guy who's prone to get beat backdoor. He's a guy who isn't the best in terms of defending, in terms of getting back in transition. So it's going to be interesting to see how in these last 23 games, Carmelo Anthony can kind of get into a rhythm where he was when the Thunder was playing their best. Paul George and Russell Westbrook, they seem to have found themselves offensively. They're getting closer to those field goal percentage numbers that are around their career highs. They're in the 44% range in terms of field goal percentage. Russell Westbrook not shooting well from three, but he's just got to manage his three-point shots. The Thunder wants Carmelo Anthony taking three-point shots. He's not making them. So the question is he going to be able to get back on track in these last few games and going into the postseason?
Barry, when you think about Carmelo Anthony, we've talked about this at various times over the year. Obviously, all three of these guys coming together, there were going to have to be some adjustments made. But when you look at Russell Westbrook's career, when you look at Paul George's career, both of them have had other guys with them at least for a year or two that, were similarly skilled, and they've played alongside other top-notch players. Carmelo Anthony's largely always been the alpha on any team he's been on. Are you starting to see signs of him figuring out what he needs to do, or is that still very much a work in progress in your mind?
I think Carmelo's done a nice job. November was rough. They clearly were a mess in November, but I think Carmelo, and since mostly December, has sort of accepted his role, which is a number 3 scorer, and it's not been an issue. I don't when the ball comes to him and it sticks, I don't think it's because he's being selfish. I think that's just what he naturally does. It hasn't, I don't think, created any chemistry issues. He's helped them out a bunch, making tough shots when they get stagnant. So to me, the Carmelo adjustment is no problem. As Eric the Red said, the Carmelo defensive issues are a problem. That's going to carry on into the playoffs. They're going to have to live with that. Billy Donovan's going to have to know how to adjust with all that. But the offensive cohesion, I think, is largely been fine here in the last couple of months.
Well, that brings up a next topic, Eric, when you talk about the defense and bench players and who fits with who and how they try to make this group work together as it relates to the defensive end, because you're likely to have those big three out there in crunch minutes. What are you expecting to see from the bench as this team gets closer day by day to the playoffs?
Well, that's a good question. You've seen this bench perform well at times. They started the season really well. They tailed off at times, and then they've gotten it back together, particularly during the Thunder's streak where they were rolling and winning a bunch of games. We've seen this bench unit come into the beginning of quarters at times and either hold serve or be able to extend leads, which is something the Thunder couldn't do last year at all. I mean, that's a fact. The Samaje Christian units, those units where Enes Kanter was the primary offensive guy, they just weren't getting it done when Russell Westbrook wasn't out in the game. Now you have more options. Now you have some guys who kind of expanded their game. Jeremy Grant's gotten a lot better in terms of getting to the foul line. You have him working inside the three-point line as opposed to outside of it, and I feel like he's found more of a comfort zone there. You'd like to see Patrick Patterson continue to hit three-pointers. He wasn't great initially before the break, but he's had some spurts where he's gotten himself up to 39, 40% from three. He's tailed back a little bit. Big key is Alex Abrines to me. Can this guy continue to play decent enough defense to where he can stay out on the floor? That's always been the issue with Alex Abrines. Is he defending without fouling? It seemed like he was getting into a rhythm going into the break. Then he had that left hip contusion. Abrines' issue has always been defending without fouling, not getting injured, being able to stay on the floor so you can get the most out of his three-point shooting. And I think that if he's able to stay healthy and continue to move his feet and progress defensively, he might actually have a role to play in these playoffs because they're going to be going up against the Houstons and the Golden States. And one of the big fears you have about going up against those teams is being able to guard the perimeter. And as we've seen, Alex Abrines has a propensity to foul guys from three. I don't think Terrence Ferguson is going to be an option for this team going into the playoffs because they've just been horrible with him on the floor, aside from a game against the Lakers. And, he had a bright spot against Memphis where he hit a couple threes, but he hasn't really been able to hold up defensively in terms of not fouling a ton, and his shot hasn't been there. And you'd expect that from a 19-year-old. So a lot of questions left about the bench unit coming into the playoffs and down this stretch run. I think the only reliable thing you've had so far basically is Raymond Felton and Jeremy Grant for the most part. Other than that, a lot of questions about the other guys.
Barry, as you think about the bench and what Eric brings up about the fact that there are so many questions about that next group of guys, while they have a lot of pieces, who can you count on is a question for Billy Donovan, and where can you put those guys in big situations? Is there a guy that you feel like Eric, alluded to the fact that Abrines is pretty darn important in that group? Is there a guy that you would point to say, boy, if he really comes along and becomes consistent, it could help the Thunder a ton?
Yeah, and this guy's been playing better, and I could see him playing more in the postseason, and that's Patrick Patterson. Mm-hmm. He got off to such a slow start, and he's sort of a hit and miss guy offensively. Not that he looks bad, he just sort of looks invisible at times. But when he is active, he moves the ball well. He clearly is a solid three-point shooter. I can see Patrick Patterson playing more and more, and I think that would be very advantageous. He's potentially a good defender at that power forward spot, guard some on the perimeter. I like Patrick Patterson a lot. I think he's got playoff experience. I think come playoff time, he could be a guy who really invigorates that bench, which the Thunder bench is not great, but the truth is most teams' benches aren't. Golden State's bench isn't any good at all. Minnesota's bench isn't very good. Portland's isn't. There are a lot of teams struggle with their bench. That's why they're on the bench. But I don't know that the Thunder's going to get avalanched. Last year they got avalanched on the bench because they had nobody to run an offense. This year they do with Raymond Felton. So I don't know that the bench is going to be the cause of the Thunder downfall.
Well, we're talking about guys that need to step up around Westbrook and George. Obviously, both of them playing at a really high level. Eric, it doesn't look like the Thunder's likely to bring in any extra pieces. They've had that roster spot open. The buyout market, though, has been pretty quiet. We haven't seen a ton of options for the Thunder to even go after, much less acquire. So it looks like this is the roster, likely to be the roster for the playoffs. So who has to bring it? I mean, we know Carmelo. Is he the main guy, or would you point to some other guys to really need to step up when it comes to building around the nucleus of George and Westbrook?
You know, it's going to fall mostly on those starters. You know, Paul George has to continue to shoot well from three. Russell Westbrook has to continue, you know, to have his mid-range game work. You know, be aggressive as he always is, and it's really important for Russell Westbrook to be able to find those guys in the corners and find those guys from three-point range. We saw in the Memphis game in the second quarter when Russell Westbrook was able to get downhill, coming off of screens and find guys in the corners. The Thunder was lethal. You know, finding Patrick Patterson, finding Raymond Felton, Paul George in transition. If Russell Westbrook can get to doing that, he's always been the key to the Thunder offense, and even more so now because he's surrounded by more shooting than he had been last season. So that's a key for a guy like Patrick Patterson, who's been really good from the corners. He's just been okay from, you know, around the arc and above the break. But from the corners, Patrick Patterson's been fantastic this year shooting the three. So if Russell Westbrook can continue to probe and find those guys there, he can make his teammates better. That's why the Thunder gave him all that money. That's why he's running the team, you know. So, you know, to make Steven Adams better, to make Patrick Patterson better, to even make guys like Carmelo and Paul George better. So, you know, it's crazy to say we have to put more pressure on Russell Westbrook, but this is what the Thunder has been building for since Kevin Durant left, you know, trying to find the best way to build around Russell Westbrook. He has more weapons now, and it's going to be great to see on the playoff stage how Russell Westbrook is able to get those guys the ball in the spots they need to get it.
You know, Barry, Eric mentioned a name that I don't think we'd mentioned to this point just a second ago, that being Steven Adams. He's maybe been, I don't know if you'd say he's the most consistent guy that they've had on this team, but he's been really good on both ends of the floor, spectacular at times in games. What is his role in your mind? What does it need to be to maximize what this team could accomplish rest of the regular season as it heads into the playoffs?
Well, Stone Cold just needs to keep doing what he's doing. Not getting foul trouble. That is occasionally a situation with him. That would be, you know, last year, when you think about really no answer for Russell Westbrook when he took a rest, the Thunder really has no answer for Steven Adams. They just go small on occasionally Dakari Johnson plays. But in the playoffs, if Steven Adams takes a sit, they're just going to go small. And there's certain teams you don't want to do that. You can't go small against Minnesota. So it's a case of he needs to watch the foul trouble, needs to make his foul shots. It's starting to come around. He was good early, awful here in the middle of the season, gotten better here in recent weeks. So that needs to improve, but he's playing magnificently. He's a wonderful player. He leads the defense. He is sort of a foundational player on offense in terms of always in the right spot, always making himself available for the rolls to the basket for Russell Westbrook, setting the screens. The Thunder can't play without him.
There might not be another guy that's more important to the Thunder in terms of foul trouble situations than Steven Adams, because you know, Billy Donovan said it last week when he got in foul trouble in that third quarter against Memphis. That's when they started to make their comeback, because the offense wasn't able to open up the passing lanes they were previously, because Adams sets such great screens. He attracts so much attention when he's rolling to the rim. He pulls that defender from the weak side, and that opens up the corner for Russell Westbrook to pass out there and get Patrick Patterson, Raymond Felton, whoever's standing out there, those open looks. So Steven Adams has become so important to this offense. I don't think that can be overlooked anymore, and he's going to be key for them in the playoffs. Yeah,
we like to talk about how great he is defensively, and that has not changed, but he's become a very important part of this offense as well. You're right, Eric. Guys, before we look to the weekend when Oklahoma City has, you know, one of the marquee games anywhere, that being against the Warriors on Saturday night, Barry, much as I mentioned, Eric referenced a piece that he had written earlier this week about the Thunder and the goals that they have to look at, things they need to be focused on headed into this remaining schedule. You also wrote about the schedule And the fact that the Thunder still has some really tough games remaining, 2 games against the Warriors, the first of those 2 on Saturday, 2 games against the Rockets. But I guess maybe is the good news that they aren't alone. Is that kind of the saving grace here?
Yeah, you know, when you look at the 8 teams that are sort of bunched together, 3 through 10 in the West, the Jazz has a pretty easy schedule. The Spurs have a pretty difficult schedule. The other 6 teams have very similar schedules, so and mostly more difficult than easy. Lots of showdowns. There are 33 matchups left in the season in 49 days. 33 matchups that are pitting those 2 of those teams, 3 through 10 in the West. So virtually twice every 3 days, we're going to have one of these Western showdowns that will go towards playoff positioning. So kudos to the schedule maker. It's going to make for some interesting basketball. You know, the Thunder is really not any worse or any better than shape than the rest of the guys.
And Eric, I guess when you think about the way this team has played this year, and even, I mean, not just the evidence of what we see on the court, but what they've said, this is a team that plays to its competition. And I guess if you're wanting to get playing your best headed into the playoffs, if they're playing good competition, maybe this helps this team in some way.
Yeah, it could, or they could go to Sacramento and lose, and go to Phoenix and lose. I mean, look, this team has a bad habit of going out and playing against playing the bad teams closer than they should, or just playing the bad teams poorly. You know, we saw that against Memphis before the break. We saw that earlier in the year against Sacramento, Orlando, Phoenix. You can name all the bad teams in the league. The Thunder's had a bad game against them, basically. So we don't know what's going to happen when the Thunder goes to Sacramento tonight, or when they go to Phoenix next week on the first night of a back-to-back, where they have to go to Portland, and they haven't beaten Portland in 7 straight times in Portland. And Portland's a good team, but Phoenix, I think they've lost 3 straight in Phoenix. So there's no telling for this Thunder team. One thing that's positive for the Thunder in terms of the schedule, the teams in front of them, I mean, aside from Golden State and Houston, who are obviously the 2 elite teams in the West, you know, San Antonio, they're not going to have Kawhi Leonard. And they would have had a short time to get him integrated back into the team going into the playoffs. But they're not going to – it looks like they're not going to have him at all for the rest of the season. So San Antonio is going to be a team that's going into the playoffs without their best player, without a player that's a difference maker for them in a series against an elite team like a Golden State, Houston, or even the Thunder. And as for Minnesota, frankly, they've never been there before, so we don't know what to expect from Minnesota. Russell Westbrook's been in playoff battles. So is Carmelo Anthony and Paul George and Steven Adams. So the Thunder are going to have a playoff experience advantage when it comes to playing against Minnesota if they do have to face them, and particularly coming down the stretch and winning some games and trying to get playoff positioning. Minnesota's in a position where they have some guys that haven't been there before. You know, Jimmy Butler and Taj Gibson have, and so is Tibbs. But, you know, they're going to be counting on some young guys, Andrew Wiggins and Karl Anthony Towns, who still have to prove something in terms of doing something in the playoffs.
Yeah, you mentioned, you know, sort of games that could really derail the Thunder here early as they get out of the All-Star break. And we'll talk about Sacramento in a second. But as I mentioned, that Saturday night game, Barry, against the Warriors, I mean, thus far, the Thunder seems to have the Warriors' number. I don't want to say that the Warriors have a Thunder problem, but they've won by double digits, have the Thunder both in Oklahoma City and in Oakland. You got to think the Warriors will notch a win on Saturday night, but they don't. That's not only a physical issue. It seems like that maybe start to be a little psychological for the Warriors.
Well, I think I actually think this Golden State team is a little immune from that, even if the Thunder swept in 4 games. I do think on the other side, I do think it would fortify the Thunder mentally. The supreme confident nature of Curry, Durant, Draymond Green, that crowd, I think sort of keeps them from getting too down on themselves no matter what happens. Durant was defiant apparently yesterday and talking about how good this team is despite its problems. So I guess what I'm saying is a Thunder victory in Oakland Saturday night would help Oklahoma City more than it would hurt Golden State. Mm-hmm. I think the Thunder's pretty confident against Golden State, but if they were able to go to Oakland and win twice without Andre Robertson, that would make you feel halfway decent about their chances to compete in a series with the Warriors. Because, three-point defense, perimeter defense is one of their biggest problems without Andre. And, if you survive Golden State, that means you're doing something right.
Eric, I know you're wanting to talk about that Sacramento game, but give us your keys against the Warriors. If you're heading into that game, you've got to know that the Warriors want to get a victory for no other reason than you're on your home court. They're coming out of the All-Star break. Guys should be feeling pretty fresh, pretty rested. What does the Thunder have to do to maybe get that third one in a row?
Feed the big man. Steven Adams he's been really good against the Warriors this year. He killed them in the last game early. I think Russell Westbrook and Paul George are going to play well. But Steven Adams has always been, to me, an X factor against the Warriors because they really just don't have anybody that can account for him. His athleticism on offense and his versatility on defense, being able to switch. So I think that if they feed Steven Adams early and often and get him involved in the offense, I think that's going to pay dividends for them against the Warriors. And frankly, the guys around the stars playing with confidence. I think we saw in the last game, nobody for the Thunder really had a poor game against the Warriors, and those guys all played really well. I think these games against the Warriors winning, whether it's in Oklahoma City or Oakland, it does more for those peripheral guys besides Russell Westbrook and Carmelo Anthony and Paul George and Steven Adams than it does for anybody. Josh Houston's had a tough ending to the Washington game a few games before the Thunder played Golden State in Oakland, where he had a bad turnover at the end of the Washington game. He was able to play against Golden State, put the ball on the floor, score at the rim. That's not even Josh Houston's specialty, but to see him do that against an elite team and to do it with confidence, I think that does more for those guys' confidence going into hostile territory and doing the things that they did against the Warriors last game than it would be for Russell Westbrook scoring 36 points. Russell Westbrook's going to play well against the Warriors regardless of the setting. For the Thunder to be successful against the Warriors in a playoff setting, those peripheral guys have to be successful against them right now.
Yeah, and so far they have been pretty darn good in both those games. So again, though, as Barry said, another game without a great perimeter defender and Andre Robertson. Seems like to me that having more defensive success, while I think you're right, Eric. I think having that offensive success is pretty darn important. Being able to figure out ways to keep the Warriors from just shooting lights out, that's a huge confidence boost as well. So that'll be a big one on Saturday night. But let's talk about Sacramento for just a second, because Sacramento and Phoenix, Eric, you referenced this a bit ago, have been places that for whatever reason have been trouble, have been issues for the Thunder. Carmelo Anthony even talked about this Sacramento game being pretty big. I know that nobody's going to confuse the Kings for the Warriors, but this is an easy way to have some momentum stalled if they go to Sacramento and lose again, I would think.
Yeah, it'll be bad for them. They put themselves in a position to where they can't really afford to lose these games to bad teams. They've got to go win these games against bad teams, put teams away early, make it a 3.5, 3/4 game, and to where they can get rested and they can get wins under their belt that they didn't get in the first half or the first quarter of the season. Starting 8-12 to start the season, the Thunder lost to Sacramento, and they lost some games that they shouldn't have. So if they're going to be losing these games down the stretch, they're not giving themselves any cushion when it comes to going up against Golden State and Houston, because eventually Golden State and Houston are going to catch you in the regular season. I can't expect the Thunder to sweep Golden State 4 times or sweep Houston for 3 times or however many times they play. So you got to go get the Sacramentos on the road. You got to go get the Phoenixes on the road, because those are teams that frankly don't want to win. They're trying to play for lottery position anyway. If you put them away early, they're going to fold and you're going to have a win under your belt. So there's really no excuse for the Thunder to lose this game coming out of the break fresh. Even if they don't shoot particularly well, they can still defend and they can still execute their offense and beat a team that just frankly doesn't have as much talent as them.
Barry, I think that, people were scratching their heads after that Sacramento loss earlier in the year, a game that Oklahoma City opened, looked like they could maybe shut the Kings out. Of course, it's not going to happen, but Kings just didn't seem to have any answer. And then they not only scored, but they won that game. At that point, there were still so many games left. that the math was a little bit different. Does this team get to a point, does the Thunder get to a point where they see what Eric's talking about, that you can't go losing games like this to have your seeding be where you want it to be? They've shown no ability or limited ability to do it to this point. Is there reason to believe maybe that after the All-Star break, last half of the season, all of that starts to click in their minds?
They seem to indicate that with the way they talk. We saw that here in the last couple of games before the All-Star break. Carmelo Anthony in particular talked about, hey, this is serious time. This is when you really get going. This is when you really are motivated to sort of batten down the hatches. We'll see if that's true. The truth of the matter is the NBA season is a grind. It is a 5.5 month marathon, and games in November, especially a veteran team. Veterans don't get excited about playing Sacramento in November. They should, but they don't. And when you get to the All-Star break, 23 games left for the Thunder, virtually the three-quarter pole. Well, then you sort of come into your mind, hey, this is when we need to really get going for the playoff run. So that's what they're indicating. That's what they're saying. We're going to see if it's true. This is a team. The Thunder should take care of Sacramento, no problem. But they've got, I think it's 8 of these games. I think they play 8 teams that are absolute lottery teams the rest of the way. This is the first. They need to go 7-1, 8-0 against that crowd. We'll see how they do. Tonight gives us our first glimpse.
You know, Eric, lastly, we've referenced Carmelo Anthony a couple times in talking about this stretch of the season. And while he maybe hasn't had the consistency on the court that the Thunder wants him to ultimately have, is that veteran voice? I mean, I know as good as Westbrook is, I know as good as Paul George is, those guys have their teammates' ears, but Carmelo Anthony's been around a long time and is that veteran star. Does that maybe become one of his roles, is becoming that guy that sort of talks to the rest of these guys and maybe starts to point this team in that correct direction?
Yeah, I think one thing you could say about Carmelo Anthony throughout this entire season, just being around him, is I think he's had some pretty solid perspective when it comes to how long the season is and how these guys need to come along. I think at times they've said a bit too much that, okay, we know it's a process. It'll eventually come together, this and that. And I think that was an excuse for a lot of these guys just not buckling down and taking the game seriously and how they need to develop from the start. I think they kept using that as it'll eventually come along excuse. And I think that kind of got old pretty quickly. But at the same time, I think Carmelo Anthony has kept it light. He's had a good sense of humor in the locker room. He's a veteran who's been around for a long time, so he knows that, sometimes you're going to have lulls in the season. And I think he's kept his own game in perspective, too, about, what he needs to do on the court and what some of his limitations are. I think Carmelo Anthony is a great addition. As I said, I think that he's a guy that, if you kept Enes Kanter and Doug McDermott as opposed to trading for Carmelo Anthony, Enes Kanter and Doug McDermott aren't getting you any closer to beating the Warriors or the Rockets than Carmelo Anthony is. People can argue about the money you're paying for Carmelo Anthony, but you can't argue about what he can potentially do in a playoff series that would differentiate you from having Enes Kanter, who's a limited player, and Doug McDermott, who's a limited player. You basically traded limited for limited, but you upgraded in terms of individual shot creation. And that never loses value in a series where you're going up against elite talent. So I think Carmelo Anthony has value there. I think his voice has value. I think he's well respected. I think Russell Westbrook has high respect for Carmelo Anthony. And frankly, he just brings levity to the locker room at times when sometimes this thing can get a little bit too serious for everybody, particularly with a guy like Russell Westbrook who takes things super serious when it comes to us and when it comes to the game. I think Carmelo Anthony's been a breath of fresh air.
All right, guys, we'll see how the Thunder approaches these final weeks of the regular season. Starting Thursday night, it's a 9 o'clock tip out in Sacramento, Fox Sports Oklahoma. That Saturday game against the Warriors is a 7:30 start, and it's on ABC. So be sure to stay with the best coverage team anywhere at newsok.com and every day in the Oklahoman.